I think that the audience is just enjoying hearing you guys riff because there's no questions yet, which we can just keep doing too. I'm sure we can. Um, okay, cool. So now that was awesome. I do want to put the conversation now in the context of, we've talked about like, hey, this is what can happen at the highest levels working with elite athletes prior to the combine, right? But obviously we've got a lot of coaches here on the call that might be a high school coach, right? Or in the private sector, but just a one-man show, right? Just aren't at that level of the game yet where it's feasible for them to be able to, pull in a team of specialists, right? And so now kind of reframing into that context, like Danny, let's say that a high school calls you up and they say, look, we can't afford to hire somebody like you on our team, right? That's going to come in and really manage the health of our athletes. But we want to try to educate our coaches, our S&C, to the extent that we can on how he can do it, right? And this is kind of like we've got one guy who can do all the work, right? What are some of the most important things that you might instruct them to do to make sure that they're managing the health of their athletes in in a high school setting where they don't have these resources, right?
Yeah. I'm not gonna say anything groundbreaking here, but I don't think that anybody necessarily needs an expert to put more of a priority on athlete health and wellness. And in fairness, I don't spend a ton of time in the high school settings. I don't work with a ton of high school athletes, so forgive me for being overly generalized here. But like the first thing is that comes to mind for me is teaching good foundational principles. We're always very passive about nutrition and hydration and sleep and emotional wellness and stress management. I think this is one of those things where everybody knows it, but few people understand how to actually implement it. Mm-hmm. So if we can make it more of a forefront priority and a first priority where it's done before we get too deep into training to really educate kids on the value of this, like how many more studies do we need to have come out that shows that 8 to 9 hours of sleep is like the most effective immunity for sickness, injury, and everything else. So instead of just barking at kids that they need to sleep more, we need to actually educate this process and deliver it in a way that's tangible for them. Telling a kid to go to bed earlier is not a tangible instruction. Teaching them what sleep hygiene is and the effects of blue light and learning how to kind of downregulate their body as they're getting ready to go into sleep is more of a tangible construction of that. It's the same conversation with nutrition. It's the same conversation with stress and emotional management. But what we know is that all stress leads to the same pool. So if we have neural stress, tissue stress, psychological, emotional, or otherwise, eventually it all pulls from the same systems and we deplete from the same resources. So we have to see these things as all being equal in that regard. Once we get to that point, for the coaching aspect of this, we have to really continue to break away from this mental toughness, just crush everything. Everything is high intensity all the times. What we've noticed with young athletes now, more so than ever, is that they are very active and they're playing a lot of sports and they're doing a lot of practice and a lot of drills and they have, AAU and club and all these things. So I think it's a little bit of a misconception that, athletes are getting lazier or they're not doing as much. I kind of disagree with that. So when you're the independent private sector strength coach, the first priority is figuring out what's going on right now. What are you doing in adjacent to this? Do you have practice times? Do you have club this weekend? Do you have additional coaches that you're seeing? So I think it's always like the way I've looked at it is take the onus or initiative of being the manager of the situation. So I'll be the one that can be adaptive because I'm just going to assume all of these other things that are in place probably aren't going to be adjusted. So my job is to adapt to what's being done around me. Now, if I'm a strength and conditioning coach, I don't have any manual background. I don't have any kind of, real, deep recovery stuff in my bag. That's perfectly fine. The biggest impact that you can make is adjusting the training parameters that you're providing to accommodate for what else is being done concurrently for this athlete. We can make a resounding impact with athletes without crushing them every time that we see them. understand, like Les was talking about earlier, what the daily response is, what the weekly response is, what are these trends that we're seeing over the course of time, and then just continue to give them the stimulus that's needed, not necessarily the one that you want or that you think is needed. Be very objective in what you need to provide. So if we have that opportunity, then we can put more precise inputs in for this athlete that may not be 10 sets of 3 back squats plus hill runs with chains on. But in the relative context, it's going to be more effective for you to have maybe a 20-minute kind of dynamic movement, mobility start to your session, and then maybe 20 minutes of just some, isolated unilateral weightlifting options, and then finishing out with some low back and hamstring stretching options. You send them on their way, you're giving them a better opportunity to go do what they want to do and do best, and that's play sport.
Yeah, that's huge. Like, I can't preach it enough. I can't remember the exact words that you used, but adjusting your stimulus based on the other stimulus that the athlete is experiencing simultaneously. And I think that that's like, as I talk with high school coaches all the time, right? And it's like that issue. And that's why I open the conversation with like, how do you unsilo this communication, right? Because I think that there's some takeaways there about how that communication can happen between coaches and between specialists that can trickle down to the high school level, so on and so forth. Because that's the number one thing that I hear, right? Is like, coaches are giving their athlete the stimulus that makes sense based on just their context of what that specific coach did with that athlete yesterday, right? But not what else that athlete did, not with that coach yesterday, right? And they're just like, they can get the blinders on, right? And get into these silos. And I hear, it's one of those things where it's like, I hear the frustration on both sides, or I'll hear it between private performance coaches that are working with schools, right? And there's this friction between like the coach of the high school and the private performance coach. And I hear both of them saying the same thing, which is like, this guy doesn't want to communicate with me. And so it's like, okay, you're both saying that the other one won't communicate with you and you wish they would. So it's like, where's the gap? Right?
Yeah.
Where are we missing, right? And it's like, you're both saying you want to communicate, so we should, right? So yeah, I'd love to hear that. Les, anything that you would add there?
Yeah, I mean, you're all like, there is no specialist because you're all just managing time, and your system has to take into effect like all the components that you want to get done. So when you're competing for things, you're usually competing for time spent on certain qualities. And if you look at it as like, you have to be able to speak the language of the coach. You have to be able to speak the language of like the Danny and the performance coach and those types of people. And if you can do that, then you're really just going to plead your case for more time in certain areas. So when you set up your systems, like whether it's implementing a warm up or a cool down or like a break or like a hydration break or a snack break, like all you're doing is building your system around the things you think are important, which is health and performance. So like working with high school teams, like we worked with Del Norte, for example, and all we did was like take the warm up and add 5 minutes. And in that 5 minutes, we just did a couple max speed exposures. And then the value of that grew as a team won. And then it was like, okay, can we get 10 minutes? Yeah, okay. And then all of a sudden we're doing, hey, can we do like 2 to 3 sessions primarily dedicated to speed? I was like, yeah, but can we take one of those sessions and make one of them a strength session? And all of a sudden it's like you've bought more time. And I think that's the biggest skill set from a practitioner standpoint that we need to look at, is like, you really need to speak the language of the coach and buy into like what the coach is trying to do, which is win games, stay healthy, and like score more points than the other team, right? Super easy. And if you could do that, then you're just going to start to buy more and more specific time periods that you can control, so.